अगला जो प्रेजेंटेशन है वो रोएन शार्प साहिबा अपना पेपर पेश करेंगी और रोएन तकाबुली अदब की स्टूडेंट हैं पीएचडी की जो हिंदी उर्दू के साथ साथ स्पेनिश पे भी काम करती हैं और शुक्रिया.
Okay, so the title of my paper is Up in Smoke, Unchecked Desire and the Fear of Female Agency in Manto's Dhu'an. And I'm sort of going to pick up where Sabina left off. So thank you very much for doing that introduction. This is sort of going to delve a little deeper into some of the issues that you picked up. So Dhu'an, as you guys have heard, is the story of a young boy named Masood who experiences the first stirrings of adult sexuality through a series of unsettling encounters, touching a skinned goat, massaging his sister's back and thighs, and spying on her sexual explorations with a female friend. In one of our first class discussions, Professor Haider asked whether it would make a difference to our interpretation of Dhu'an if we were to change the genders or the ages of the siblings at its center. At that time, I felt instinctively that it would matter, and somehow the story's message depended on the relationship between a younger brother and an older sister. But I struggled at that time to articulate why. The thoughts I'm going to present to you today are my attempt at a clearer argument about how the particular dynamic between these two characters expresses larger anxieties about sexuality and agency that are relevant to many of Manto's best known and most celebrated works. Dhu'an is unsettling, pornographic even, precisely because how clearly it illuminates the relationship between beliefs about male desire and the possibility for female sexual agency. So to follow my argument, I'm going to propose three kinds of ambiguity that we're all just going to have to agree on. And they are the ambiguity of character, the ambiguity of ending, and the ambiguity of body. The first of these is that Manto tends to choose protagonists whose perspectives are significantly outside of the mainstream, hovering between endearingly idiosyncratic and pathologically deviant. So as we just saw, thanks to Saif, usually it's not possible for us as readers to determine conclusively whether, for instance, Tapish Kashmiri's adventures into women's clothing represent a psychotic break or one more iteration of his typically and relatively harmless, quirky dress habits, having previously included everything from full boots to total nudity. Our uncertainty is fueled in part by a second proposition, which is that Manto's stories tend to end at a moment of acute ambiguity, suggesting two opposing possibilities for the future. So for instance, to what extent Sirajuddin's daughter is alive or dead at the end of Koldo would be one of these examples. And this question in turn leads us to the third and final proposition, that some of Manto's stories suggest a connection between women's bodies as sexual objects and nearly dead and often edible flesh. Take, for instance, the titular incident in Tanda Gosht, in which a man is startled and disgusted to discover the body that he is raping is dead, giving the sensation of cold meat. Or the enigmatic description of Sakina's brutalized body at the end of Koldo, apparently still responsive to stimuli, but nevertheless called a lash. Or even the description of women's bodies in Pundane as a basket of cartilage. There is a wonderfully illuminating book by Abdul Jan Muhammad called The Death-Bound Subject, that some of you maybe are familiar with, that can help us address the theoretical significance of this last proposition. John Muhammad works from Agamben's concept of bare life in order to define a subject position for someone at the very margins of human existence. The concept of bare life comes from Homo sacer, one who possesses, comes from Roman law and means one who may be killed at any time without it being considered a murder or a sacrilege. John Muhammad extends this idea by using a contrast between, quote, flesh and, quote, meat. He says bare life or flesh is close to the 0 degree of subjectivity that is defined as readily killable. However, we must remember that when one kills flesh, it is transmorphed, it dies and becomes meat. Meat, one can say, is insensate flesh, and to the extent that meat rather than flesh is the absolute 0 degree of subjectivity, the zone inhabited by bare life, or the death-bound subject, is that between flesh and meat. So Manto writes women's sexualized bodies as being in exactly this death-bound position between flesh and meat. The description of the young woman at the end of Tanda Gosht, of course, is the most evocative of this, but what is more startling to me is the way that in the same story, the fiery and aggressive sexualized body of Kulwant Kaur is just as easily transformed into flesh. Manto writes, Ishar Singh peeled her clothes off as skin off a goat. It strikes me how exactly this image mirrors the skin goat that attracts Masood at the beginning of Dhu'an and sets up the paradigm for his increasingly sexualized experiences of pleasure as the story progresses. Since John Muhammad's definition of bare life explicitly includes availability to rape and mutilation as well as death, I think we should consider women in Manto's stories as experiencing a version of bare life, what we might call bare sexuality, meaning that the negative latency they experience is not between life and death, but between sexual autonomy and violation, sort of what Sabina already talked about. The flesh of the goat encapsulates this. It is sensitive and responsive to stimuli, the male touch, but not independently animate or capable of rejection. Just as the threat of culturally sanctioned killing ensures that flesh is always readily convertible into meat, the threat of rape has the potential to readily convert any woman at any time into an object of men's sexual advance. By taking this logic to its end, we see Masood developing an attraction to hunks of newly slaughtered flesh. And in this, Manto develops the first powerful element of his twofold critique of such a culture. But such an explicit image would be all too easily disavowed as merely perverse if it did not come to us in the guise of a child's imagination. What mitigates the perversity is the fact that of Masood's innocence. He has begun to experience flesh as pleasurable, but he cannot consciously connect it to a cultural narrative about sexuality, nor can he control or direct his pleasure, and thus cannot be blamed for experiencing it. However, because of the tendency toward ambiguity of character and plotting identified in Propositions 1 and 2, the question remains as to whether Masood's burgeoning sexuality will ever normalize. Will he come to understand the feelings behind the Dhu'an, the smoke, as sexual and learn to direct them appropriately outside his own family? Or will his confusion persist or even metastasize into a severe pathology that will only grow more intense or even violent over time? Already in the story, there is some evidence that things will not get better. For while Masood may claim innocence, the incident between him and his sister Kulsum, and also between Kulsum and her friend Bimla, suggests that she cannot. It confirms something that we already suspect, that Kulsum understands and controls something about sex that Masood does not. At some point, as the minutes slip away and Masood becomes more and more engrossed in the act of massaging his sister, Kulsum must be aware that he is deriving pleasure from the act, a pleasure whose inappropriateness she is much more likely than him to understand. Her sighs and groans seem to suggest that she too is deriving a sexualized pleasure from his touch. Instead of stopping him, she consciously takes advantage of Masood's poorly understood sexuality to stimulate her own. In this scene, Manto is able to masterfully link two seemingly opposed notions about women's sexuality into the single body of Kulsum. Her body is passive, and nevertheless, she is the one who demands and controls the sexualized act. In the patriarchal imagination, as Manto describes it, the extremes of passivity and aggression in female sexuality are not in fact opposed, but work together as part of a larger cultural narrative. Women are considered to possess bare sexuality exactly to the extent that their bodies constantly provoke male attention without regard to their own desires. Therefore, even in the very moment when women are nothing more than sexually available and minimally responsive flesh, they are still considered to exert an enormous power over male sexuality. Ironically, this conception of female sexuality as agency, even when they are the ones being raped, produces a second kind of bare sexuality for men, in which men's subjectivity is threatened by their availability to desire. Regardless of whether the provocation is aggressive or passive, if men can only conceive of their desire as being provoked, then their sexuality is never under their control. In this sense, the threat of Dhu'an is not only that Masood may never be able to break through the clouds of confusion regarding his sexuality, but that all men are eternally condemned to be victims of their own uncontrollable and perverse desires. Ultimately, this is why the sibling relationship has to be exactly as it is for Dhu'an to have the impact that it does. A young boy feels a powerful desire that he cannot understand or control. An older girl understands and demands more than what she seems to. Only these positions can accurately reflect the general cultural anxiety that no matter how tightly women are bound by the threat of rape, they still hold sexual power over men. Manto's task is not simply to provoke pity for women who have been victimized by the idea of bare sexuality, although that would have been sufficiently noble in itself. Instead, in Dhu'an, Manto manages to show how bare sexuality threatens the very people it would seem to benefit, and thus makes a case for their stake in dismantling the system as well.
Beautiful.